Namaskaram. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya. Today I've been asked to talk about sēva as taught by Bhagavan. Bhagavan's ultimate teaching about sēva is expressed by him in verse 29 of Upadēśa Undiyār. The verse is Atma-vichara parasukumutra varinda nilay nitral undipara irepani nitralam undipara. Pani is a very nice word in Tamil. It very two words, very two separate verbs. Pani. The one meaning of pani is to sink low or bow down, and therefore it as a noun, pani means to do service or to worship, particularly worship. But worship in the sense of doing service to God. So ire pani means doing service to God. Pani is also a verb that means to speak or say or order. So ire pani can also mean as ordered by God. So there are two meanings we can take in this context. But the whole verse is, Bhagavan begins by saying, Atma-vichara, devoid of bondage and liberation. Why does he say devoid of bondage and liberation? Because our true state is beyond all dyads, all pairs of opposites, all dvandvas. So bondage and liberation are dvandva. Only if there's bondage can there be liberation. The ultimate truth is there is no bondage and therefore no liberation. That is, when we know what we actually are, we will know we are ever liberated. So Bhagavan says that supreme state is beyond bondage and liberation. So Atma-vichara parasukam, the supreme bliss beyond bondage and liberation. That is the supreme bliss. That's our own real nature. What we actually are is that supreme bliss. Utravaru means in such a way as to attain or to experience, or in this case, in this context, thereby experiencing. So that's an adverbial clause. The main clause is inda nilay nitral, irepani nitralam. Inda nilay means this state. Nitral means standing, or that literal meaning is standing. It implies abiding or being in this state. What is the state he's referring to? Is the state he talks about in the previous verse, in which he says, Tanadil yadu ena tan teri hil pin anadi ananta sat undipara akanda chidananda undipara. That means if one knows what the nature of oneself is, then beginningless, endless, that the beginningless is anadi. Endless, or that ananta means endless. It also means limitless, infinite. Akanda means unbroken, that indivisible. It implies undivided and indivisible. Sat, Chit, Ananda, existence, awareness, happiness. That is what our real nature is, and that is what alone will remain when we know what our real nature is. So it's this state of Sat, Chit, Ananda that Bhagavan is referring to in this verse when he says, Inda nilay, this state. So being or abiding in this state, standing in this state of supreme bliss, in this state, thereby experiencing supreme bliss, devoid of bondage and liberation. That is irepani nitra, abiding in the service of God, or being in the service of God. Or we can take it as service, we can take it as worship, or we can take it as subsiding. That is, to the extent to which we subside, to that extent are we truly serving God. What is God? God is nothing but our own real nature. He is just Sat, being, Uladu, what that which is. His natural state is just to be. But when we rise as an ego, we give him the work of appearing as Guru appearing in the form of Bhagavan to tell us to turn back within and thereby saving us from ourselves. So we are unnecessarily giving him work to do when we rise as ego. So the state in which we don't rise as ego, the state in which we remain as we are, just being as we actually are, that is the true service of God. This is Bhagavan's final conclusion. So true service, true worship is not a doing, but just being what we actually are. And what we actually are is that supreme bliss, which is devoid of both bondage and liberation, devoid of all pairs of opposites, all dualities, all dvandvas. So this is the ultimate teaching of Bhagavan on service. So this is our aim. Our aim is not to do anything, but just to be. As Bhagavan sometimes said, I think it's recorded in talks in one place, Bhagavan says, your duty is not to be this or that. Your duty is just to be. So just being, that is our duty. That is what Bhagavan has enjoined upon us. And how do we just be? Only by this practice of self-attentiveness. That is the nature of ego, is to rise, stand, and flourish by grasping things other than itself. As he says in verse 25 of Uludu Napadu, Urupatri Undam, grasping form, it comes into existence. Urupatri Nikam, grasping form, it stands. Urupatri Undu Mika Ongam, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. Uruvittu Urupatram, grasping form, leaving form, it grasps form. Tedinal Otum Pidicum, if sought, it takes flight. What is that it? Uruvatra Payahande, the formless phantom ego. So ego has no form of its own, but it cannot come into existence or stand or flourish without grasping form. The first form it grasps is the form of a body consisting of 5 sheaths, which it takes to be itself. And then through the five senses of that body, it grasps forms of the world, the seemingly external world, but is actually just in our own mind. It's just a dream, as Bhagavan says. So since ego is formless, all forms are things other than ego. So what Bhagavan means by grasping form is being aware of or attending to anything other than ourselves. So since this is the nature of ego will subside only to the extent to which it grasps itself. That's why he says, Tedinal otum pidicum. If sought, it takes flight. That is, if ego, instead of attending to other things, if we as ego, instead of attending to other things, turn back to try to attend to ourselves, we seek what we actually are, otum pidicum, it takes flight. Takes flight here is a metaphorical way of saying it will subside and dissolve back into its source. So in order to be as we actually are, we need to investigate ourselves. So the greatest service we can do to God or Bhagavan is to turn our attention within and try to hold fast to self-attentiveness. This is the ultimate teaching of Bhagavan. That is, this is the path of self-investigation and self-surrender. We surrender ourselves, give ourselves wholly to him only by clinging firmly to self-attentiveness. However, the general understanding of sēva involves doing something. People think if you're sēva means you have to be doing something. Actually, the word sēva it is a noun derived from the verb sēv, which means to dwell or stay near or in, to remain or stay in, to live in. In other words, it's got that same sense of just being. And then secondary meaning is, because it means staying or being, it also means waiting upon or attending upon. In other words, serving. And it's also serving in the sense of also worship. So sēva doesn't just mean doing service. It means service in the sense of worship of God. So only whatever we do, only if we are doing that in the spirit of worship of God, but is it true sēva in the deeper sense of the term? So, but this is sēva at a different level. So when we are thinking about doing, we've already slipped down from that state that Bhagavan says we should stand in, that state of just being as we actually are. That is the most perfect service. However, when we rise as ego, the nature of ego is to let it, that is, the ego's attention is by nature flowing outwards. So when we allow our attention to go outwards, we are under the sway of our vasanas, our vishaya vasanas. And under the sway of our vasanas, as soon as we allow our attention to go outwards, we get involved in action by mind, speech, and body. So this is how karma starts. But Bhagavan says in verse 2 of Upadēśa Undiyār, he says that in the first verse he said that karma giving fruit is only by the ordainment of God. That is, karma doesn't give fruit by itself. It's only God who decides what fruit should be given at what time for which action. So, because action is just is jada, as he says, it's non-aware. So it cannot be God. It cannot. Action cannot decide its own fruit. God alone can decide the fruit, and because he's all loving, he decides when, where, and how we should experience the fruit of each karma in such a way that will be most beneficial for us, spiritually beneficial for us. So when we do any action, the action is done, but the fruit of the action is then out of our hands. It's entirely, it goes and is stored in sanchita, and it is experienced by us only when God ordains it to be experienced by us. In other words, the old analogy is of shooting an arrow from a bow. Once you've shot the arrow from a bow, you no longer have any control over it. If you misaimed the arrow, once you've shot it, it's too late to bring it back. So once we've done an action, the fruit is out of our hands. It's in the hands of God, and God alone decides when we should experience action. So, and the actions have two results, two consequences. One is the fruit, the other is the seed. The fruit is palamasaswatam, as Bhagavan says in the Sanskrit version. The fruit is impermanent, because when we experience the fruit of an action, that action has therefore come to an end. That fruit has therefore come to an end. So Bhagavan begins in Tamil by saying, Vinayam Vilevu Vilevutru. That is, the fruit of action perishing. That when we experience the fruit of an action, it perishes. But it remains, though the fruit perishes, the seeds remain, and the seeds are the problem. The seeds are what cause us to fall in the ocean of action. So Bhagavan says, Vittai, as seed, Vinay Kadal Virkidam, it causes to fall in the ocean of action. So what causes us to fall in the ocean of action is the seeds. Those seeds are vasanas. So vasanas are the problem. The vasanas are the seeds that cause us to fall in the ocean of action. And then he concludes the verse saying, Vidu Tarile. It does not give liberation, or it is not giving liberation. That means action can never give liberation. As he says in the Sanskrit version, unfortunately, the Sanskrit version, because he wrote in a shorter meter, he doesn't explicitly refer to seeds. He just says, Kriti Mahodado Patana Karanam. That is the cause for falling in that great ocean of action. What is that cause? The cause is our vasana, the seeds. Palamasaswatam, the fruit are impermanent. Gati nirodakam, it obstructs liberation. So action is not the means to liberation. It obstructs liberation. It cannot give us liberation. However, in verse 3, he says, he gives a concession. He says, Katano kakam nishkarmiya karmam karte tirti aktu undipara gativari kambikum undipara. What that means is nishkarmiya karma. That's action done. Karmiya means motivated by desire. So nishkarmiya is action that is not motivated by desire. But why do we act? There's always some motivation for any action. That is, we don't just act for no reason at all. We act for a reason. Generally, our actions are driven by desire. But if we want to do action that are not driven by desire, we need to do it for the love of God. That's why Bhagavan says, Kartanukakam, done for God. That implies done for the love of God. In the Malayalam version, because Bhagavan wrote in a slightly longer meter, he was able to put in more words. He says, I think it's Ishwara Pritiyanai. Pritiyanai means for the love of God. So Kartanukakam means done for God. It implies done for the love of God. So instead of our actions being motivated by desire for achieving this or that for ourselves, if we do it just for the love of God, that will purify the mind. What will purify the mind here is not the action itself, but the love with which it's done. For example, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, for example, worshipped Kali. He worshipped Kali with the pure love of a child for its mother. So he worshipped Kali with pure love. There are so many people who worship Kali, but they're worshipping for some aim. They think if we worship Kali, we'll get this benefit or that benefit. So it's not the action that purifies the mind, it's the love with which it's done. If you're worshipping God for the fulfillment of your desires, that's not going to purify your mind. Or it will in a very roundabout way purify the mind, because the more we think of God, the more we depend on God, slowly, we will cease asking God for this and that, and we will come to trust God, but God knows better than I do what is good for me. So there's no need for me to ask God. So in a very indirect way, even Kamya puja will purify the mind, but that's a very slow and roundabout process. If we truly want to purify the mind, we need to worship God without any desire for without any kamyata, without any desire, without seeking the fulfillment of any desire. We worship Him just for the love of Him. So desireless action done for God, purifying the mind, Gati Varikambikam. It will show the way to liberation. How will it show the way to liberation? Because when Bhagavan says purifying the mind, actually in Tamil he says karate tirati, that means rectifying the mind. It implies purifying the mind. What are the impurities in the mind? The impurities are our vasanas. The vasanas, the vasanas that have a real problem are the Vishaya vasanas. Even the karma vasanas are secondary to Vishaya vasanas, because any karma vasanas means the inclination to act. Why do we have an inclination to act? Only because we've got an inclination to experience some Vishaya. So Vishaya vasanas are the driving force behind the karma vasanas. So if the Vishaya vasanas are the true problem. So the more we cultivate love for God, the more our desire for other things will drop off. Our inclination to attend to other things will come to rely on God, trust in God, and love God more and more. That purifies the mind. And when the mind is purified, it is thereby clarified. And when the mind is clarified, it will recognize that the path to liberation is not any action, it is just being. We can reach God not by doing anything, but only by being. Because what is God? God is nothing but our own being. The very nature of God is being. God is Ulladu, that which is. God is Sat, being. So the way to reach God is by just being, as Bhagavan indicates in that verse 29. Ultimately, what is our ultimate aim? Just to be in that state of supreme bliss that is our own real nature. But in order to understand that just being is a means to liberation, the mind needs to be purified. And it can be purified by doing action, not for the fulfillment of any desire, but just for the love of God. So here Bhagavan begins to talk about action done without desire for the love of God. What type of actions can we do? We have three instruments of action: mind, speech, and body. So in the next verse, Bhagavan says, Didumidu, this is certain. Pujai japamam dhyanam udal vak ulla toril. Puja, japa, and dhyana are actions of body, speech, and mind. That is, puja, the actions we do for the love of God by body are puja. The actions we do by speech for the love of God are japa. The actions we do by mind for the love of God is dhyana. And then he says, Vivu ahum ondril ondru. That means literally means one than one is superior. What the implication is, but better than puja is japa. Better than japa is dhyana, because the speech is a subtle instrument from the body, and the mind is a subtle instrument from the speech. Always at a subtler level is more powerful. So, and in what sense does he say it's superior? Superior means in the sense of more efficacious in purifying the mind. And then he goes on to talk about these three, puja, japa, and dhyana, in the next three verses. In verse 5, he says, Enuru yavum ireyuru amena, eni vari padal undipara, isan nalpusane undipara. Worshipping, thinking that all eight forms are forms of God is good worship of God. All the eight forms, the Ashtamurti, this is a concept in Shaiva Siddhanta, but Shiva has eight forms. These eight forms are, there's slight variations in how they're enumerated, but basically, 5 of the 8 forms are the 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, and space. And sun, moon, and jivas. That is the basic meaning of the 8 forms. So that basically covers everything. That is, all things are composed. That all material things are composed of the material elements: earth, water, fire, and air. The mental things are composed of the subtle forms of these 5 elements. And there's the sun and the moon. They're physical things, and sentient beings, other jivas. That means human, not only human beings, but also all sentient beings, all animals and devas and all types of all sentient beings, whatever be their form. So we can worship any of these, considering them to be forms of God. That is good worship of God. So there is nowadays, there's a very widespread belief that nishkarmiya karma means doing social service. This is very much an idea that this idea, I think to a large extent, it was spawned by Swami Vivekananda, which he did in a certain context, and that's good at its own level. But nishkarmiya karma means much more than doing social service. If we understand it in the sense of this verse, that is social service we're doing by body. Because one of the 8 forms is jivas, whatever service we do to jivas, if we take those, jivas means whether they're human or non-human jivas, if we take them to be forms of God, and we serve them accordingly, that is a good worship of God. So there is room for this, but it's not the main meaning of nishkarmiya karma. And that's by body. A deeper type of nishkarmiya karma is the japa that we do with love. So this is what Bhagavan talks about in the next verse, verse 6. He says, rather than praising, that means rather than singing stotras, japa is good. It's the implication. This is an extremely, Bhagavan has packed a lot into this verse in very few words. The verse is, Varitalilu Vaikucha Vaikul Japatil, Virupamam, Manadum Undipara, Vilambum Dhyanam Idundipara. So what that, if we translate it literally, it means rather than praising in a loud voice, rather than japa within the mouth, what is done by mind is beneficial. This is called dhyana. We have to flesh it out a bit to understand the implied meaning. What it means is, rather than praising God by singing stotras or whatever, japa is beneficial. Rather than japa done in a loud voice, japa done softly within the mouth is beneficial. And rather than japa done softly within the mouth, mental japa is beneficial. Beneficial here again means it's more efficacious in purifying the mind. That's what Bhagavan means by beneficial. Because here the whole subject of these verses is about purification of the mind. That's the purpose of doing any nishkarmiya karma for the love of God. The aim is the purification of the mind. So that more purifying than singing loud stotras is doing japa. More purifying when doing japa in a loud voice is japa done softly within the mouth. More efficacious than japa done softly within the mouth is mental japa. And mental japa is a form of dhyana. And then so these are all nishkarmiya karmas. So nishkarmiya karma isn't just going out to save the world. The spiritual practice we do is the nishkarmiya karma. And then in verse 7, he talks about the dhyana. He says, Vitu karaktalin arune vichipol, vittida dunnale undipara, visejdamam unnave undipara. That means, rather than meditating leavingly, in other words, rather than interrupted meditation, certainly meditating unleavingly, that is uninterruptedly, like a river or the falling of ghee. Just as a river or a stream of that, if you're pouring ghee, it flows without a break. It doesn't go drip, drip, drip. It's a steady flow. Like a river is a steady flow. So meditation, if it's such steady, uninterrupted meditation, that is superior. Why is it superior? Because if we are meditating on God, either on a name or form of God, if our meditation is often interrupted by other thoughts, what does that indicate? It indicates that we're more interested in the other things we're thinking about rather than God. If our meditation on God is constant, that shows the love that we have for God. So the constant meditation is more efficacious or is superior is more efficacious in purifying the mind because it is done with greater love. That is so again here, what Bhagavan implies here is that the love is the key, right? When the love is there, we will keep our mind fixed on God. If our mind is wandering here and there, keeps on going away towards other things, that indicates our love is still lacking. We have some love for God, but it's not yet sufficient. Here, up to this point, Bhagavan has been talking about karma, about nishkarmiya karma, actions that we can do for the love of God by body, speech, and mind. But the most important verse in this series is the 8th verse. Because in the 8th verse, what Bhagavan says is, Anya bhavatin avanahamahum ananya bhavame undipara anatinum utumum undipara. Rather than anya bhava. Anya means what is other. So anya bhava means meditating on God as something other than oneself. That's the implication. So rather than meditating on God as something other than oneself, certainly ananya bhava. Ananya bhava means meditation on what is not other. In other words, meditation on oneself. Avanahamahum, in which he is I. So when we understand God is not something other than ourselves, God is that which is shining in our heart as I, when we consequently meditate on nothing other than I, anatinam uttamam, that is the best among all. And what Bhagavan refers to here as ananya bhava is another way of describing the practice of self-attentiveness. That is, when by following the path of bhakti, we finally our mind is purified to the extent that we understand that that God is not anything other than ourselves. God is that which is shining in our heart as eye. When we come to understand that and our attention turns within, that is best among all. It's best among all in the sense that it's the most purifying of all the practices we can do. But attending to other things is an action, because when we attend to something else, our attention is going away from ourselves towards some other thing. Whereas attending to Ananya Bhava, attending nothing other than ourselves, our attention is not moving anywhere, it's resting in its source. So Ananya Bhava or Atma-vichara is not a doing but a being. That is what Bhagavan indicates in the next verse, verse 9. Verse 9, he starts by saying, Bhava Balatina, by the strength of meditation. The meditation he's referring to here is the Ananya Bhava that he spoke about in the previous verse. So by the strength of so the Ananya Bhava means self-attentiveness. So the implication here, what Bhagavan implies by Bhava Balatina, is by the strength of a firmness, the intensity of a stability of our self-attentiveness, our Ananya Bhava. Bhava Balatina, Bhavanatita, Bhava Tirutale Undiyār, Parabhakti Tattva Undiyār. By the strength of such meditation, of self-attentiveness, being in Sat-bhava. Sat-bhava means the state of just being. Bhavanatita, which transcends all bhavana. Bhavana here means meditation in the sense of thinking or imagining, or that meditation on anything other than ourselves is what is referred to here as bhavana. So meditation that involves activity of the mind. So being in Sat-bhava is not an activity of the mind, it's a state of just being. And how do we achieve that state of just being? That is by the strength of this meditation, of self-attentiveness. And Bhagavan says, that alone is Parabhakti Tattva. This verse 9 connects us back to verse 29, in which he says, just being in this state, which transcends of this state, in which, thereby experiencing supreme bliss that transcends bondage and liberation, that is abiding in the service of God. That abiding in the service of God is what he refers to here as Parabhakti Tattva. This is the nature or reality or true state of supreme devotion. So what is this supreme devotion? By the strength of self-attentiveness, in other words, by the strength of our self-investigation, just being as we are, that is the supreme devotion. So this is the true service that Bhagavan has enjoined upon us. So this isn't to say the other actions are wrong. Nishkarmiya karma is very good, but it's a roundabout way, and it's just a means to come to this. Ultimately, our aim is just to turn our attention within and thereby be as we actually are. That is achieved that by our self-attentiveness, we remain as we actually are, and that is the true service to God. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya.
Mr. Michael James, thank you so much. It was again a wonderful occasion to hear your guidance. If you will all
Bhagavan's guidance, not my guidance. I've just been talking about what Bhagavan has told us. I don't have anything to say of my own.
Absolutely.